episode 21 of International Expansion Explained. My guest this afternoon is Victoria Rennoldson. Now, Victoria is a communication coach and cross-cultural trainer. She's also the CEO and founder of Culture Cuppa. She helps global leaders to elevate and amplify their communication skills and multinational teams to build trust and collaboration with cultural intelligence, growing themselves and their businesses globally. She's a keynote speaker, certified associate trainer with the Cultural Intelligence Centre, and she's also the host of the top-ranked podcast, Cultural Communication Confidence, where I was a guest a couple of months back. Welcome, Victoria, and thank you for joining me today.
Well, thank you so much, Catherine, and thank you so much for the very warm welcome as well. It's really exciting to join you live for your episode today.
Maybe you could just start out by explaining to us a little bit how it was that you got into international business, because I think that you, like me, have a linguist background, don't you?
That's right, absolutely. Yeah. So my background originally was I studied languages. I studied German and Russian and spent time in Germany, Austria, where I know you are, and Russia as well. And I absolutely adored getting to know these countries, live in these countries, and was really fascinated by, of course, when you actually live in a country, it's more than just language. It's not just about the language. You have to understand culture as well. And some of that is about how things are done, how things are not done, but also how people in reality communicate. And I've always had this real then fascination and curiosity for this whole area of cross-cultural communication. After my studies, I then decided to go into marketing. And I ended up working with a healthcare company and then went into FMCG, fast-moving consumer goods in the food industry. And I worked in marketing for 12 years. And with my role, I was based in the UK, but working with teams all over Europe and quite regularly traveling across Europe, working with factory teams, technical teams, sales, all of the teams. So for me, what was really interesting was being able to work with people in different cultures, mostly in Europe, but also with people in the US and in India as well. And what I really got to experience at that time was how to work with different people, how to understand what works when you're motivating and getting people to help you with projects and working towards a common goal. And I absolutely loved that. I really enjoyed understanding those nuances. And when I was the person sort of sitting in the meetings and listening to people, whether that was virtually in the days way before Zoom, when it was Skype or one of those old school kind of video conferencing tools that we used to have. Right, exactly.
Yes.
Like where the video never worked, right?
Yep.
But, we did a lot of in-person stuff as well. But I always found it really fascinating that, yes, I was there to do the meeting and be part of the conversation. But I was also that person in the room who was like, ooh, I wonder why they said that. And why, why do they say it that way? And I just always like to just analyze why people were expressing themselves in the way they were. So I think my sort of language background, my interest in other cultures sort of really came into this particular career. And that's how I got involved in international business. Did that for 12 years and greatly enjoyed it. Absolutely had a brilliant time and very much enjoyed working with products and marketing those in different markets. And then it was after that my curiosity was really piqued by this idea of how do people communicate? Why are they communicating the way they do? And that real kind of insight and that idea is what led me then to set up my business almost 9 years ago now, just about to celebrate my 9th birthday, which is exciting, and got me into thinking, well, maybe this is something that individuals, but also companies need help with, teams need help with, how to communicate better culture to it.
Yeah, it's it's always fascinating, I find, when you've got a group of different cultures in the room and you can really start to see how different people approach the completely different ways, isn't it? So, well, understand how that could kind of get a grip on you and how you would like to go out with that. But we've named this session today Speaking Like a Leader. So maybe we can start out by digging in a little bit into what do people actually mean when they say that they want to be able to speak like a leader, because I'm sure that that means different things to different people, doesn't it? It's not such a straightforward question as it might appear on the outside.
Absolutely. And I think, what's really, really interesting is that even the idea of what does a leader mean in different cultures, that has a nuance, right? So particularly if you think about how people relate to hierarchy, how they expect decisions to be made, how they expect to be consulted, involved in the conversations along the way. So, it's not easy thing to kind of define. And in fact, if you kind of look at dictionary definitions of even what does leader mean, I sort of would look at that and go, well, that's not very satisfactory. They're often talking about directing people or, telling people what to do, which of course isn't really what leadership is about today. But if I talk about, what do my clients talk to me about and what's on their mind when they talk to me about speaking like a leader, the kinds of people that I work with are really very talented and ambitious global professionals. They are often already sort of mid to senior career and they are very experienced already. They've got great skill sets and expertise. They've got lots of certifications already if they're in a technical area. And what they're really aiming for is the next level. And what that looks like to them could be many different kind of job roles. It could be C-suite. It might be just more of a senior leadership role. But they recognize that to get to there, it isn't about having more expertise or more technical knowledge or more of the specific certifications they had to get to that point. Actually, what they do need is more about how they communicate and come across to others, how they motivate and inspire teams, how they share what it is that they're trying to achieve, their vision. It's sometimes talked about in terms of confidence or speaking assertively. And that might be in the context if people are feeling like they're having to have challenging conversations. And then there is that sort of like little something, the X factor, which people find very hard to define. But that sense of, sometimes it's called executive presence or leadership presence.
Kind of charisma, isn't it?
It
In
could
some ways.
be charisma. For some people, the expression of that is charisma. For others, it's more about gravitas. That's the kind of energy they're going for, that more kind of serious, grounded, formal energy. But it expresses in different ways. But it's that sort of sense of, who's a leader and in the way that they're communicating and speaking. You know it when they walk into the room, and you know it actually when they're not inside the room. So you recognize it because when people are talking about them, their perceptions of them is at that level, right? So this is kind of like the people I work with, this is what they're aiming for. They really recognize it's their speaking skills, their communication skills at that level, which is really going to make the difference for them to accelerate their career and actually reach the career goal.
And do you find that that has changed since the beginning of the pandemic? Because from what I mean, at the beginning of the pandemic, that was a time when I hadn't been self-employed for very long. So I was watching a lot of my friends who were still in employed positions, in leadership, often in leadership roles. And those who were in Europe, most of them were kind of taking great pains to send that message of, we're all in the same boat and, we're all in this together. Whereas those of them who were leading teams in Asia, they were expected to, their teams expected a much more directive kind of if you like, almost old-fashioned type leadership, or what we would see in Europe as a much more old-fashioned type leadership, because they expected the leader to kind of have solutions, which of course nobody really did have solutions, but at least to have the solution of, let's pull together, let's do what we can, let's, we have to do this. And the way that they were expected by their teams to approach problems was completely different.
I mean, this is where we're talking really about cultural intelligence, right? So this is about understanding that what people expect from their leaders is nuanced and differs from culture to culture. So, you were talking about in Europe, and again, it's not consistent across Europe. There are nuances within that as well.
Yes.
But let's talk about, say, UK culture, which we're both familiar with, and we're both kind of very, both from UK cultures originally. And I think, from that point of view, yes, there was that sense of leaders having some level of bringing people together, but also that sense of vulnerability, which is, I know, a word that people have talked about a lot recently, but the vulnerability of, okay, we don't have all the answers, and this is what we are doing about it right now. So this is the action we're taking, but almost an honesty around, we don't have those answers. We don't necessarily know all the next steps, but we can give you the idea of where we're going to go for the next step, and then maybe step 2. And I think there was an appreciation of people seeing leaders being much more open and vulnerable, and seeing them in their home environments, and maybe children popping up behind them, or whatever it was that was going on. There's a much more of a sense of personal sharing. Now, if we think about cultures where it's much more important to have that sort of stronger leader, that sort of more clear view of who is the leader, who is the person making decisions, then what is important in all of that is you have to recognize some cultures have a real focus on hierarchy, right? That actually what's really important is they're looking to a leader who is going to be in control no matter what's going on, that leader is able to make the decisions, is able to give the clarity on direction. And this is where cultural intelligence is really interesting. Somebody might be a very successful leader in the UK or the US, but if they're then managing a team that is mostly sort of Asian, there might be a very different behavior set that's required from them, and a different communication style, because that's the other thing that massively shifted in the pandemic, right? Like the way that we communicate massively shifted. And I can talk more on this, but even how we run virtual meetings is nuanced culturally. Like, as a leader, you have to understand not everybody wants to contribute in the same ways,
or even turn their cameras on.
Well, so
way.
So for some people, they will not turn their cameras on, and that is something sometimes about privacy. Sometimes it's about, obviously, there are various things going on simultaneously, but even the way people contribute. So, I know that it's quite usual, I'd say, as a UK US culture, to say, okay, in a big team meeting, just unmute, let us know what you think now, just kind of, share your views. Well, actually, the reality is, in other cultures, that's not okay. Like, you're asking people to contribute in a way that is deeply uncomfortable to them. So in individualist cultures, people are happy to unmute themselves, to say what they think, to just speak up, to see what they contradict the boss, spontaneously express views. But perhaps in some cultures, actually, you can't do that. So at one point, I was working a lot with Japanese clients, and you need to really think very carefully about how you invite contribution. That includes things like potentially circulating materials and information before the meeting, so people have time to reflect and think about it. Giving space for time for people to come together in small groups and discuss it. So breakout rooms work quite well, so that people can come to a collectivist view of what is the right thing to do. And also recognizing that people are much happier to write their comments in the chat, or to even reflect and come back with answers afterwards. So these are just a few examples of how that might look really different in the current environment.
Or even, I mean, as Elizabeth quite rightly said, culture and expectations often vary even within a company, from one
Yes.
department to the next. If you've got completely different leadership styles of whoever is in charge of that department, that can really vary a lot. And I mean,
Absolutely.
to just go back to the example of meetings in Japan or meetings in Asia, often the meeting itself is purely for, let's say, taking care about the relationship, isn't it? And actually all the decisions have been made either ahead of time or they're going to be made afterwards, but decisions are not made in meetings often.
Yeah, that's the interesting thing, right? It's a formality sometimes. It's the rubber stamp on what's already been agreed or discussed in individual meetings or in small group meetings beforehand. I
Sometimes
think,
it feels like you're in a really carefully orchestrated play, where everybody
yeah.
has this role to play, but
Yeah. And if
yeah,
you don't know the roles, like, if you're somebody who's not familiar with the cultures and the norms, the values and the norms of that meeting, that's really disorienting, because if you're used to being a leader, being very successful in one environment, you've really got to develop the cultural intelligence skills to then be able to apply it then to another environment as well. So, coming right back to your original question, what does that mean to speak like a leader? Well, to speak like a leader, there are different interpretations of that, and it is nuanced culturally, which is why you've got to apply cultural intelligence to be able to communicate in a way that's going to connect with people, engage them, and bring them along.
yeah. So what are the main barriers that leaders actually face in their communication? Because I'm sure that those change at different stages in their career. As people
Mm,
become more senior, then they're wanting probably to move away from that first among equals kind of, I'm actually an expert in the subject matter and I'm maybe a department head, to more of a situation where they're looking at more strategic topics
mm.
during their day-to-day work, and they're looking to develop that kind of gravitas, as you mentioned.
Well, I think for the people I'm working with, the vast majority are speakers of English as a second language. And
Right.
that's not to say that language is is their challenge or their
No.
barrier. In fact, for many of them, they are fluent by most people's
Yeah.
standards. But
Hmm.
what I mean by that is, the reason I mention it is that for these kinds of global professionals, there's often a interior monologue going on about what's going on in the situation when they're aiming for that role or first achieving it. And I've heard people tell me it feels like you're really exposed, that no matter how experienced you are, and how much you're very deserving of the promotion, that you
Hmm.
still got that little bit of doubt and imposter syndrome going on in your head about, am I expressing this in the best way possible? Is
Yeah.
this clear? Does it come across the way that I want to? Do I sound articulate? And often this is because people are very often, because they're at that level, they are very good at what they do. So they're quite often quite perfectionist about this. So when that comes to their speaking skills, their communication skills, they've got concerns about how they're coming across. And that might look like them holding back sometimes in these environments to just really get it clear in their head what they want to say before they say it. It might look like that they are trying to get it clear, but then almost miss the opportunity to speak and share what they've got to say, even though they've got brilliant ideas. And there's often a dialogue in their head going around, well, I can see other people in the room who are extrovert, they're confident, they
Yeah.
are louder than I am. And again, that could be culturally driven. And I just, I'm just not there. And that can feel quite intimidating. So I think, there is a whole lot of things going on in their heads, which is quite noisy, right? It's a noisy space to be when you've got all of this chat going on. And the barriers, therefore, or it's not their fault, but it's often coming from themselves around some of the beliefs they have around confident speakers, people who appear to be speaking like a leader. And there is that sense sometimes that people are born this way, that they are born to speak in this way, to be articulate and extrovert, and to express themselves so well. And the reality is, most people have learned those skills on their journey. I wasn't always myself a particularly confident speaker. I shared this on LinkedIn the other day. You know,
Mhm.
I personally went through a period in my early career where I really hated speaking. I really didn't enjoy speaking in public and presenting. And now it's my job. It's really funny how these things happen. But I suppose the point I'm trying to say is it's a journey. It's not something that people are born with or not. You can develop these skills. And also, really importantly, it's not like a switch that like turns on like bing, you're now the confident leaders speaking in this way. People have their up days and the down days, the days when they're speaking really fantastically and days when they're really not. And so that's true for everybody. Well, pretty much everybody, I would say. Even people who've done TED Talks, even people who are public speaking will have their bad days and off days. So that's kind of, I think the barriers are often about some of the limiting beliefs that are going on and some of the things, I suppose, beliefs about what other people are doing. And that doesn't make it any easier. It doesn't mean that I suddenly, we turn around and reflect this and people are like, okay, I get it. Clearly there are skills to be learned as well, but it's a mindset space as well. It's about helping people with the mindset of, okay, how do you feel into this as well as do it actively?
Yeah. And I think that a lot of people, especially if they're working in their second language, or maybe their third or sometimes even fourth language,
Yeah.
I think that often if they've had some kind of a put down early on in their career where they've had one toxic person in a meeting who's said to them that you haven't quite got the right end of the stick. It's a good expression, isn't it, in British English? That they haven't quite understood something correctly that's been said in a meeting because it's not their native language. I think that those kind of throwaway comments that sometimes I've heard used against non-native speakers of various languages as a kind of put down to keep them from taking up their rightful space actually in a meeting, they often have much longer term effects than the comment actually merited, or than the person who said it was actually thinking, even if they were saying it with a kind of malicious intent.
Yeah. Well, it could be that they've had feedback, at some point, or a throwaway comment, as you mentioned. It could be that they haven't had any feedback,
Yeah.
but they still feel judged by how they
Yes.
sound and how they speak and worry about that.
Yeah.
It could be also that when you get a group of people together and most, say 50%, at least 50% are people who have English as their first language, what tends to happen is the conversation speeds up.
Yeah.
It tends to be have lots of idioms. You talked about idioms and expressions, and people are using these like metaphors to I suppose to demonstrate what they mean. But if you don't get the idiom and you don't get the expression, it's really easy to lose confidence in your communication abilities and the fact that you are a great communicator. But this is, a barrier as well. And then finally, things like cultural references, the use of humor. People often use humor in meetings to try and bridge and connect and engage people.
Yeah.
However, humor can be really alienating, because if somebody doesn't understand the context of the humor, everybody else is laughing and they're sitting there thinking, I don't get it. Like, what's funny? And either they laugh along and pretend, or they feel like, wow, okay, there must be something wrong with my communication skills here, that I'm not getting this. And let's be clear, what we're talking about here is not about people's English skills, because that's not what it's about. The people we're talking about are people who are really fluent English speakers, and there's nothing wrong with their language. This is about communication. So, if I turn this around, I think there is also a job to be done by particularly leaders who have a very diverse team, who've got multilingual, multicultural teams. It's really important for you as a leader, who, if you're listening and watching this today, to consider this. How are you adapting your communication style to be inclusive?
Yeah.
How are you thinking about the way you communicate, invite contribution, like we were talking about earlier, thinking about why you're not hearing from some voices in the room? How do you increase the share of voice for some of those people? And what's going to do that in a way that's going to help them along their career journey? But also the team's going to benefit, right? Because people are going to hear the ideas of everybody, the fresh ideas, the thoughts and views. And that's the sad thing. What happens at the moment is sometimes you only hear the loudest voices if you're the leader. You only hear the people who are happy to unmute, say what they think spontaneously. You miss some of the richness of all of the opinions that are going on.
Yeah. Or those people who, if somebody interrupts them, they completely stop, or they immediately, if somebody asks them a clarifying question, there are people who, because they've had some kind of, maybe going back to their school time when they were first learning English and somebody asked them a clarifying question, they immediately assume that the question comes because they said something wrong and not because that person was playing with their phone and so they didn't actually quite get the beginning of the story, or they didn't quite grasp the connection or something like that. There are lots of communication issues that are nothing to do with language, aren't there?
Absolutely. Yeah.
And I think that if, as a leader, as a native speaker, you also have to be very aware of the fact that that you tone your language down, if you like, to a more, not a more academic, but to a more, maybe a more correct version, one that doesn't include reference to minority ball games, like the Brits tend to include lots of references or idioms that come from cricket, or the
Yeah.
Americans use lots of things from American football or from baseball. And if you don't understand what those mean, you're completely thrown, aren't you? You have no way
Absolutely.
of following.
Yeah. I think everybody has a responsibility in the room to communicate clearly and for everybody, so that everybody understands and comes along on the journey. And I think that's the really important bit of it for me. It's about, if you're a leader, regardless of what your first language is, it's about bringing people together and making sure they come along with you on that journey. You don't want to be sort of dividing people and for people to feel disconnected and disengaged because they don't feel part of the conversation.
No. And I mean, at the end of the day, communication hasn't taken place just because I've spoken a sentence. Communication has taken place because you've understood what I've wanted to say with that sentence, hasn't it? That is when
Oh, wow. Absolutely. And look, if we're going to broaden out, I mean, conversation is a communication is a two-way thing, right? It's not just me broadcasting and talking and talking
Yeah.
and talking. It's also about listening skills and listening for what's not being said. Again, that can be quite important culturally to recognize when there's a pause, which could mean a disagreement or not happy
Yeah.
with something. It's also recognizing that we have to observe people's nonverbal communication, and again interpret that through a cultural lens. So if we are sort of working with people who are very expressive, if they are very expressive, they might express themselves in a way that sounds like maybe they are angry or frustrated about something, but it's not. They're just very passionately feeling something. And equally, if you're working with people who are very non-expressive, they perhaps don't show so much emotion through their facial expressions or hand gestures or body language, it can be hard to decode. Like, what do they really feel about some of these topics? Are
Yeah.
they happy or are they not happy? And
Mhm.
again, this is where we need to apply cultural intelligence. And that's where, I'd love to be able to, really help teams with this, because I think it's so critical that recognizing when you're working in very global teams, people based in many, many different locations, you have to understand the people you're working with at all levels of communication.
So, as far as I know, you have, when you're talking about this topic, you talk about 4 pillars of communication, right?
Yeah. So when I'm thinking particularly about what I call global leader communication, there
Mhm.
are 4 key pillars that I talk about and focus on. So
Right.
those pillars are confidence.
Okay.
And that really relates to some of the barriers we were talking about earlier around how people really sometimes have quite large confidence challenges. And by the way, confidence challenges affects people at every stage of their career. It's not something just at early stages career. I've
Yeah.
worked with incredibly senior leaders who are experiencing some very large, some very great confidence challenges as they're stepping into the C-suite and having these more strategic conversations and feel stretched out of their comfort zone. So confidence is a really large part of this. That's the first pillar. The second pillar is clarity. Absolutely important. We've spoken about it a few times today, but being able to express yourself clearly and concisely. And that's not, by the way, just what you say, the messages and defining like what you are at the content of what you say. It's also how you express it in a way that's going to land, again, that is going to be heard and listened to by the other people. So that's the second pillar, clarity. Then the third pillar is about connect with cultural intelligence. I've mentioned cultural intelligence a few times today, and I think it's so critical, but clearly we connect in other ways. And particularly in today's world, post-pandemic, the way that we connect is sometimes really challenging. Technically, we can connect it in an instant. Like, we just hopped on a call. We're doing this LinkedIn Live. You're in Austria. I'm here in London, the UK. But for us to really connect, we need to have good conversations. We need to understand each other. If I'm trying to influence somebody in my team to do something or a senior stakeholder, I need to build connection. So that's a really important pillar. And then the fourth pillar is challenging conversations, because I recognize that as people become more senior, they often need to have more challenging conversations. That could look like disagreements. It could be about giving or receiving deeply honest feedback. It could be, as I've had with a client actually this week, talking to me about passive aggressive behaviors and how to handle that, how to respond and not react. These are things which are really challenging to work out sometimes by yourself. That's why these four pillars I see as really critical for anybody who wants to develop their global leader communication skills. And that's where, I believe the four areas sit.
And so how can people start to work on those? I mean, obviously people can come and work with you, but if people are sorry, not at a stage in their career where they feel that they can do that, what are maybe some small steps that they can take to start to work on any gaps that they might feel that they have within those four pillars?
Absolutely. So first of all, obviously, I'd be delighted if anybody wants to come work with me, of course.
Of course.
But let's get practical here. Like, what are sort of ideas can use and do to help them develop some of these skills? Well, I think a core part which runs through all of these pillars is thinking about people. Yeah. So thinking about who you're talking to. And I think there are sometimes when we're communicating, we're so focused on what we want to say, and we're not thinking enough about other people, the people we're talking to. And it doesn't matter whether we're talking about a one-to-one conversation, whether we're talking about a virtual meeting or a large-scale presentation, whatever the form of the communication, we need to be coming back to who is it we're talking to? What is it that motivates them? And I'm sure you're thinking about this in your world as well, but like what's in their head, literally, like as they come into this meeting, what are they thinking about this topic that you've set up? What are they concerned about? What are they worried about? What are they going to come and challenge and ask you questions about? But beyond that, go on. Sorry. Yeah.
Well, I was going to say it's very much almost the kind of thing that you would be looking at in a sales training, isn't it? Because it's that question of what is the point that they need to have solved before they can accept your idea.
Yeah,
And so
Exactly.
you need to be really listening to what they're actually saying and not just kind of sitting there waiting for your chance to say whatever it is that you want to say.
And I think that's really interesting because, you know, I think people do plan. Obviously, clearly they plan things like presentations and meetings, but they're
Yeah.
really focused on, okay, this is what I need to get across. Yeah. And that is important as well, by the way. But I always like to kind of start from, but you know, who is it you're talking to here? Like, what are they really thinking? What's in their heads? And that requires obviously empathy skills, emotional intelligence, cultural intelligence, particularly
Mhm.
if you're working with people from very different cultures. And then, you know, the other thing that I really like to sort of ask the question on is that people often will think about what they want this group of people, for example, to know. So they've got knowledge they want to share. They
Yeah.
might think about the action. So what do you want them to do? But what is it you want them to feel
Yeah.
at the end, actually? Like, what's the feeling? And some people might be listening to this and going, okay, I get that. Others might be going, what do you mean
I don't
feeling?
care what
But
they
what I
feel
mean,
about. Just do it.
just do it, get on with it.
Yeah.
But what I mean by this is the feeling is the energy you want to leave in the relationship.
Yes.
So are you wanting them to feel really inspired and like pumped up and yeah, we can do it? Or is this more of a type of communication where you want them to feel really reassured and
Yeah.
supported? Or anything, you know, anything in between? Or is it more about them sort of understanding some hard truths and something they need to take responsibility for, and they feel a mixture of positive and negative emotion in that? But that intentionality around the emotion, I think, is a really interesting one to think about, and thinking about what is it I want them to feel at the end? Because the way you approach it, how you show up, how you do things will impact that as well. So that's just one area. There are many different areas, but hopefully
Yeah.
that's quite helpful and practical for people to think about here. So yeah, I'm sort of quite curious, Catherine. I mean, obviously you're somebody who probably does this quite a bit, but is the feeling bit of it, is that something you include in your training as well, to think about
That is
that?
that is something that I really like people to include because it's often one of the things that's also hardest for them to decode. If
Mm,
if I'm doing a training which involves, let's say, Europe and Asia,
hmm
because they find the differences in body language very difficult to decode,
hmm
or that kind of they see people as having a very poker face.
mm.
Um, I mean, I've had that said to me in the past before, but I also remember being told as a teenager that, you could read every emotion from my face. And then when I started working with Asia, I was just like, I've got to stop that because
Well, I mean, that's really interesting because I often describe it to the people I work with as a volume dial. And
Mhm.
you are naturally who you are. You have your natural sense of expressiveness and how much you show through that.
Yes.
Whether you are, as you described it, poker face, that means not showing much emotion, or whether you are somebody who's incredibly expressive and using lots of body language to demonstrate that. But it's kind of like a volume dial. And I say to people, you don't want to be completely the opposite of what you normally are, because that would feel weird and not like you. And you'd be trying really hard to be suppressing who you are. That wouldn't be what I would suggest. But let's imagine your level of expressiveness from 1 to 10 is normally around a 7. Let's say you're a little bit expressive. What I would be saying to you is, okay, well, can you play around with that? And thinking about the cultures you're working with, what
Mm.
would that look like if you dialed it down to a 5 for people you're working with who are less expressive?
Mhm.
And for people you're working with who are really expressive and really appreciate that demonstration of passion and warmth and everything else that goes with that can go with expressiveness, why not dial it up even more, go up to a 9 and play with that? But it's an experimentation, so it's like this big volume dial that you're kind of playing with, and you're trying to still be you, but you may need to adjust it. So going back to my example before, working with giants, I have to very conscious of sitting much more still, try not to move as much, not using so many hand gestures. And I still have a level of my face. I use a lot of facial expressions, but I sort of just basically just tone it down a little bit, just to make sure that it's not too overwhelming, it's not too expressive, and just because I'm conscious of this. So yeah, I think this is kind of, I suppose, an example of how it kind of plays out.
Yeah, and I think that also that with the two of us having a languages background, we both know what it feels like to sit with people where you don't really understand everything that's going on around you. And so you're looking at all of those clues that you can get, be those body language or I don't know, the way that somebody's playing with their pen, or the way that you can see them shuffling a little bit around the table, or looking at anything that you can grasp onto that's going to help you to understand more of what is going on in the present context of the meeting that you're in. And I think that that is something that for people who've never really been in that situation, they find it quite hard to understand just how much information you can actually get by being a very good observer of what's not spoken, and by focusing on some really key aspects of the conversation that's going on, and kind of mirroring things back to people to make sure that you have really understood.
Yeah. I mean, what I would advise people is that this is completely new to you. It's not something you really kind of thought about before. It starts with awareness, right? It starts with us being aware, oh, okay, this is a dynamic that's going on. And then, ideally, we want to start with self-awareness, understanding ourselves. So if you have the chance, understand your own cultural preferences, how you're showing up, coming back to this idea of speaking like a leader, what does that look like to you? And then start observing other people's body language and nonverbal communication, like you mentioned, Catherine. I think this is a really great way to try and decode what's going on. But, sometimes it's the opposite. So I'm sort of reflecting and thinking about examples of, I remember when I used to be traveling quite regularly to Hamburg and in Germany, and working with a factory and technical team there. And I remember sitting in a meeting and sharing, I'm sort of giggling, the ideas that we were going to be launching, the new innovation ideas. And somebody just saying, Victoria, I really don't like your ideas. And I'm giggling because, of course, that style of communication is incredibly direct.
Yeah.
But
What's
having worked
that direct?
so that's interesting as well, right? Different speaking, different same language but different countries. There's nuances in that. But there was a real sense of, there wasn't any malice in that comment. There was no bad intention. It was just an honest reflection that they didn't like the ideas. And at the time, even though I knew it was a very different way of expressing disagreement with my ideas from what I had experienced in the UK, I understood through my languages and living abroad, living in Germany before, that this was not intended to be rude or abrupt or confrontational, which it would have been perhaps in a UK environment, but it was intended to be direct and honest. And one of the things that I've worked with quite a few Dutch clients who were expanding in the UK. One of the things they talked about was how hard they find it sometimes to decode the words of what people say, because people are more indirect in the UK in their communication style, and they found it very hard to understand where they were with potential customers, what it was that they were really saying behind the smiles and the niceties of what was being said.
There's quite a famous meme about this, isn't there? What the British said and what the Dutch understood.
Absolutely. And these memes, of course, are more exaggerated and stereotyped. And I think we also have to recognize that, not every British person is like this, not every German person is like this. And that's where I think cultural intelligence helps us quite a lot, because we're seeing the person in front of us and we're understanding, what do we change in our own behaviors, communication style to adapt, to be better fitted to the situation and get to a more successful working outcome.
And realistically speaking, if I want to speak like a leader, then I have to also apply those principles within my own language group and cultural context as well. It's not just limited to international situations, is it? It's something that I should be applying across the board and taking each person as somebody who is on a effectively, it's a slightly triggering word these days, but on a spectrum of behaviors, because behavior can go from A to B and of what is acceptable, and each person is going to have their own specific position on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think I mean, being a leader means understanding how you adapt your behaviors and communication to successfully inspire, motivate, engage your team, bring them with you, communicate. And of course, you know, you don't have to be working across borders to be working in very diverse multicultural teams.
Absolutely.
For sure. And particularly true these days. So I think these principles are applicable wherever you are in the world right now. That is the reality of life and the richness of the opportunities.
And do you have any other techniques that you would like to share with us maybe today that people could immediately go away and try out on their colleagues or maybe on their partner for this?
Well, I mean, I've talked about people, and actually the people piece for me forms part of the 5 Ps, I call it, of clarity. And this is a way of thinking about planning any type of communication, from one-to-one conversations all the way up to sort of big presentations. And the reason why I put this together, these 5 Ps, was that I just felt like we are so rushed in our time these days. We're often rushing, well, teams are often rushing from one thing to another. Leaders are rushing from one thing to another. And there's a sense of just switching from one situation to another without the time to plan and to get the most from the communication. So the 5 Ps actually in some ways are relatively simple. They are in some ways about common sense, but they are not easy to apply consistently day by day. And that's the bit that I think is so important about this. So it starts with, well, we talked about people, but it starts with purpose. So we often will have a goal to what we're trying to achieve in let's call it a meeting. But also purpose can be about our intention with what's the energy we want to bring to this meeting. How do we want to show up as a leader in this meeting? And really thinking about, is that a gravitas? Is this about being very charismatic? What is it we want to do? There's the people piece, which we've talked into a bit of detail here today. There's the plan piece, which is actually, what's the conversation you want to have? How do you design it? I think so often we think about conversations about, okay, this has to be in a meeting room. It has to be us sitting down, having a conversation around the table. And it doesn't have to be like that at all. In fact, some conversations are better off outside the workplace in having a coffee or, you know, doing something social. Some conversations are better walking. You know, Steve Jobs was really famous for his walking meetings. That was how he said he got the best ideas. He'd take some people off for a walk and they talk and had the meeting as they went. So I think it's about getting creative, like not assuming that meetings have to happen in a set way.
I've had meetings in karaoke bars and saunas before now, you know.
Wow.
Neither of which would have been my choice, but, you know.
There you go.
Let's roll with what you've got.
You've got to, and I think, you know, when it comes to designing conversations, this is so critical, particularly if you've got a difficult conversation to have. Like you really think about how you're going to switch up the environment, the atmosphere, and create the right atmosphere to have the right kind of conversation. So, you know, that is something that, again, we don't pay enough attention to, I don't think. Then we have prioritize. So I'm a great believer in really focusing on just simplicity. We might have 10 things we want to say, but when it comes down to it, when you have to choose, what would be the most important point? What would be the most important 3 points if you really had to push it? So that if you suddenly lose the time you're meant to have and they say to you, right, we've only got 10 minutes now, can you just share a bit about what it was you're going to say? You can say it. and you're not phased. You're really clear. You've got that clarity around what's important. And the final P is points. So point to an action, point to what needs to happen next, but get specific with it, which is really what is the timing, the deadline, what is it you want them to do within what time frame. Again, simple ideas, but not always consistently applied. And I think speaking like a leader, having clarity means really consistently applying these P's to have that sense of everybody knows where you're going and where you're at and what it is you need from them.
So, I mean, if I could just summarize a little bit from what we've been discussing the last 45 minutes or so, I think it would come down to that idea of thinking about other people to make sure that you can really include everybody with the language that you're using, and really reflecting ahead of time how you can achieve the aims that you're looking to reach, not in a manipulative kind of way, but which kind of language can help you, which kind of situations can help you, and how you can go about approaching that, because far too many people don't actually give any thought at all up front. They know that they need to have a difficult conversation with a member of the team, or they know that they need to negotiate something with a supplier, but they don't really give too much thought often to exactly the process of doing that and what could be their options for solutions. They have a very fixed idea, we'll do this, but exactly the roadmap for them in their own mind as to how they want to get there isn't thought through, is it? So
yeah, for sure. And I think the only other thing I would add is the cultural piece. The just really thinking about, as a leader or a wannabe leader, like, how are you really considering how to adapt what you're doing, how you communicate, and how you engage the full team, not just the loudest, most extrovert members of the team.
Yeah, great. That has been very interesting. I have another question for you, though, which is one that I like to ask everybody. And that is, knowing what you do now, what advice would you give to the younger Victoria just starting out on her international journey? What would be your top tips?
Yeah, I think it's a really, really great question. And I think, I think one of the main points that I would say to myself is, look, you're not always going to be comfortable. Sometimes it's going to be deeply uncomfortable and you will not know what to do. And that's okay. And that's okay. And I think that's really interesting, because I'm somebody who still a recovering perfectionist myself, and it's not easy feeling in that zone. And I think without doubt, myself, yourself, most people watching this will be highly motivated by working internationally and globally. That's what this show's about,
Yes.
right?
Yeah,
So there's no
absolutely.
question about the drive and the motivation and the curiosity piece. But what is sometimes difficult is to recognize it's okay to be uncomfortable.
And it's
You will,
normal.
it's normal. You will find a way through. And, there are tools like cultural intelligence and frameworks to help you along that journey. But in reality, it comes down to knowing you're resilient, you'll be okay, and you will learn through that. And, it's not that you have to have all the answers and be confident from the first moment. In fact, you will build that confidence muscle up through practice, through time, through the journey. And just like I spoke about earlier in this live, there'll be the ups and the downs and the good days and the bad days, and that's all okay. It's just feedback and learning. So I think these would probably be the big things I'd be saying to myself 20 odd years ago. What's so important.
Thank you. And thank you very much for this wonderful conversation. There have been so many gems in there. We've pretty much come to the end, because otherwise we're going to be really over time and nobody will ever get to the end of watching. But before we finish up, who should reach out to you? And I believe you've got a communication assessment that you would like to offer
That's
anybody who's
right.
listening.
Absolutely. So there are a couple of things that I, want to share, that if anybody's been listening to this today and as an individual themselves, they're on their journey, they're ambitious, they know their next stage is to get to that leadership level, and they know their communication skills are the things that are holding them back, then I would love to offer a mini communication assessment with me. This is a complimentary assessment. We'll meet, you'll fill in a questionnaire first, we'll meet, and I'll give you some specific tips that you can apply to your situation. And then if it's aligned and you'd like any further support, I can tell you more about the Global Leader Communication Program that I offer for individuals in coaching. The other sort of thing which might be helpful is we've spoken a lot today about cultural intelligence.
Yes.
And if any leader is listening to this and thinking, yes, this is what we need in our team to bring us together and understand each other better, then I'd be absolutely delighted to talk to them about the cultural intelligence assessments and trainings that I do virtually and in person. So that is something for sure I'd be very happy to talk to people about. And then finally, people want more tips, more ideas, then please feel free to come and listen to my podcast.
Yes,
I release a weekly episode every Monday. I'm there. It's called Cultural. Oh yeah, Cultural Communication Confidence. It's on all the major platforms, but if you're here on LinkedIn, just come and find me on my personal profile every Monday, and I'll be sharing the links there. And I've been recently talking a lot more and doing a deep dive around these 4 pillars of global leader communication, plus interviewing some people, including yourself, Catherine. So you came on and we had a great episode with your conversation only about a month ago, I think. So yes, but yes, it'd be, if anybody is interested, feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn. Let's have a conversation and let's see how I can help.
Very good. Yes, I'm a big fan of the podcast. Every Monday in the gym,
your
podcast is with me. Apart from my episode, I didn't listen to that.
Yeah. Oh, well, thank you so much for having me. And it's been fantastic to join you here today. Really appreciate the conversation. I've really enjoyed it today. So thank you.
Thank you. It's been an absolute pleasure.